this video is going to demonstrate a strategy you can use when reading dramas or plays. I want you to take out your copy of Trifles and read through the first 6 pages. What this is going to do is give you the background information, all of the things that you get in the introduction, the setting, the characters, and the conflict. Then we're going to do a web where you're going to organize your ideas based on the characters. Now I'm going to be demonstrating how to do this with Trifles. I always start with the protagonist. When I examine an essay or when I examine a story, I always want to look at how the protagonist interacts with the other characters, because when I write an essay, I'm always going to focus on the story of the protagonist. And it helps to know how they interact with other characters, as well as the decisions that they make along the way. Then when it comes time to write the essay, I've got all of my ideas set up, and I just have to do the writing. Now there are a variety of ways to do character webs. I'm going to be demonstrating a very simple form. If you have a different idea in mind, I want you to use whatever works for you. That's the key to analyzing literature. Use something that makes sense to you and that you find easy to remember. The character web we're going to do, I'm going to start with Minnie Wright as my main character. She's the protagonist of the story, even though she's not physically involved in the activity that's happening. It is her fate that's being decided. When I do character webs, I like to make sure that I have my protagonist as the main person, because when I go to write essays, I always focus on the protagonist's journey. It is the one that is linked to the author's theme. So when I do my character web, I start with my protagonist at the top. I then choose the other main characters as close to the protagonist as possible and go down from there to the more minor characters. So the more lines and the more interactivity characters have in a story, the higher they are on my character web. Now, as I mentioned, this is just kind of a basic character web that I like to use. So in my top box, I'm going to have Minnie Wright. So when I do it, I'm just going to write the name of the character in the boxes that I have. Within the boxes, I will put the character's personality, perhaps some of their physical descriptions, and then outside the boxes, I'm going to draw lines between the boxes so that I know the relationships between all of the characters. So in Minnie's box, I'm going to see what is told about her from the other characters. Remember, she's not a character within the activity of the story. So everything I learn about Minnie, I learn from other people. What do I know about Minnie? Well, I know that she's a homemaker. I know that she's married to a farmer. She's a farmer's wife. I know that for the last several years of her marriage, in fact, for most of her marriage, she really has had no friends. She's quite isolated, we're told. She was fun as a young woman before she got married, we're told that, but she doesn't seem to have that same interactivity with people. She doesn't get into town much. So we know that she was fun. We also know that she likes to sing. She enjoys singing. She loved to do it as a young woman, but we also know that she doesn't sing anymore. My next character I'm going to put down is Mrs. Hale. I'm going to put her on one side, and Mrs. Peters I'm going to put on the other. But again, they're equal to each other because they're quite equally involved in the story. Mrs. Hale, we know, is also a homemaker. Now, part of understanding this is also recognizing the setting. These women are homemakers because of the time period. This is what women did. So she's a homemaker. We hear that she's a larger woman. We hear that we feel she's a little bit disturbed by events, maybe a little fearful the way she talks in the story. We know that she's concerned for others. We know that from her discussion about what Minnie's going through and the concerns about what's happening in the house with Minnie not being there and the temperatures dropping. Remember, they're concerned about the jams freezing. We know that Mrs. Hale is willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, so she has a certain compassion for people. Mrs. Peters, on the other side, well, she's the sheriff's wife. She's a homemaker as well. We hear that in comparison to Mrs. Hale, Mrs. Peters is slight and wiry, so very thin. Okay? She's nervous. Her face is described as a nervous face. She's perhaps not quite as strong a character as Mrs. Hale is. She's honest and trustworthy. She's the one first concerned about the information they find out about Minnie and whether or not they should be telling the men, because as the sheriff's wife, she feels like she has to sort of impart information that she finds to him. We also know that partially as a sheriff's wife, she's concerned about the law and making sure that the right thing is done. So there is going to be some conflict between Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters and what to do about the information that they discover throughout the story. In between these two, I'm going to put John Wright. Now again, John is a character in the story only by words of the other characters. By the time we get to the story, or by the time the story begins, John is already dead. So what we learn about him, we learn from the other characters. So what do we know about him? Well, we know he's a farmer. We know that he's controlling. We hear that from the women, not from the men. Interesting how much information we actually get about the characters from the women's interpretation as opposed to the men. We know that he's described as a cold and a hard man, so probably not particularly easy to live with. We begin to see why Minnie Wright had no friends and seemed to be quiet and nervous. Perhaps it was the sort of overbearing husband that she had. We know that John is cheap. He doesn't spend money easily. We're told that again by the women. We're also told that by the men when they come over to see if he wants to get involved in the telephone line they're trying to get. There's a possibility that John was cruel and abusive, but we don't get any factual evidence to that effect. Perhaps the best we could say is that he was perhaps verbally abusive, maybe a little bit too controlling, so abuse in that sense. But we don't know whether or not there was physical abuse in. There's just a possibility of cruelty in him. So our next character is Mr. Hale. We also have Henry Peters, and we have George Henderson. They're all pretty equal. Again, I'm going to put them at the bottom because they're more minor characters in comparison to the women. We hear about them, we hear their conversations, but they really are not as involved in the conflict as the women are. So let's start with Lewis Hale. Lewis Hale is, of course, Mrs. Hale's husband, so he's a farmer. We know that he's middle-aged. We know that he's forward-thinking. He likes thinking about the future. It's Mr. Hale that is coming to the Wright farm to see about getting a telephone line put in. Okay, it's a little bit modern. He's helpful. He wants to be as helpful as he can to the sheriff and the county attorney in figuring out what happened in the house, and he's considerate. He's concerned about making sure that everybody's warm. It's cold in the house. So he has a more compassionate kind of a personality in comparison to John Wright, at any rate. Mr. Peters, Henry Peters, is the town sheriff, also middle-aged. He's quite comfortable with his life. Again, he seems to be doing well. He seems to be happy with what he does. He's not overly concerned about process as far as making sure that the crime scene was protected and that somebody was left to make sure that nothing was moved. A small town sheriff, perhaps murder is not something he comes up against a lot. So process is not really as huge a deal for him, and that actually kind of annoys the county attorney. He's somewhat naive about the case, about really a case this big. So he's sort of following the county attorney's lead, when really the sheriff should be the lead investigator. George Henderson is the county attorney. He's quite a bit younger than the other men. He's described as a young man, in fact. Perhaps just home from university, maybe just came to town and got the job. He doesn't seem to be somebody who's known to everybody else. He's official. very official in how he organizes things and how he makes sure that everything is where it should be and nothing is touched. He allows the women to get what they need from Minnie. He's quite proud of his job. Okay. He also has a bit of superiority. Notice how in the story the county attorney is frequently referred to as the county attorney, as opposed to Mr. Henderson. So he has this official title. So there's a bit of a superiority there, not just for him over the women, which is very typical of this time period, but also of him over the men. Okay, so perhaps a little too proud. So we now have these sort of characteristics of all of the people. We have a general idea of who they are and what they're like. Well, how do they relate to each other? So what I do is I'm going to draw arrows from one character to the next and just jot in what their relationship is. So between Mrs. Hale and Minnie Wright, and remember I'm going to put everything up to Minnie because she's our protagonist. So Mrs. Hale, we started with her, so we'll just start with her again for the relationships. Mrs. Hale, we know, is a past acquaintance of Minnie's. She knew her when she was younger. She's a neighbor, we're told that. That's one of the reasons why Mr. Hale wanted to partner up with Wright for the telephone line, because as neighbors, the lines would go through both of their properties. So Mrs. Hale is a past acquaintance and a neighbor. She actually feels kind of bad about the fact that she hasn't kept up that acquaintanceship, that friendship with Minnie Wright. On the other side, we have Mrs. Peters. She's never met Minnie Wright. Now, we're told that in the conversation that the two women have. So they've never met. The only time that Mrs. Peters met Minnie was at the jail. Okay, so that was the first time. Of course, John Wright to Minnie Wright, he's her husband, so we'll just put husband in there. Now, down at the bottom, we have the three men who are investigating the crime. Lewis Hale, husband to Mrs. Hale. He's a neighbor to Minnie Wright and John Wright, but we wouldn't call them friends or acquaintances. So just a neighbor is what we're going to put in that link between Lewis Hale and Minnie Wright and Lewis Hale and John Wright. Just neighbor. On the other side, we have Henry Peters. Henry Peters, of course, husband to Mrs. Peters. His relationship to Minnie Wright and John Wright, well, he's never met them. Okay. This is the first time he's been at their house. So this is a situation where they've simply never met. So that's all I'm going to put there between those arrows, never met. George Henderson, again, somebody who's new to this farmhouse. He's never met John Wright. He's never met Minnie Wright. Again, until the crime. Okay. So those are the relationships. So that's going to help me keep the story straight as I read. Okay, so now you've seen how a character web works. I want you to go to Unit 4, Activity 4, and create a character web for the play in there.